I'd like you to turn in your Bibles tonight to the book of Genesis chapter 20. We continue a series we've entitled Foundations Back to the Beginning, and we are in Genesis chapter number 20 now this evening, and we look at another experience here in the life of Abraham as we continue to look at this man of faith. Times we have all had those moments in which it seemed as though a certain experience was happening all over again. It may be a location from perhaps a dream, and all of a sudden it becomes something you experience later in reality. It may be a repetitive scene that you think, it seems like I've been here before. There's a word for that. We use the term déjà vu. And it's kind of like, here we go again. Unfortunately, some of our déjà vu experiences are actually matters of repetitive sin. These are issues that we've battled previously, and these are issues that we continue to battle. Each one of us in our own lives has those very issues that seem to just simply be repetitive in their nature. The infamous thorn in the flesh, though it's more in the spirit, if we could just simply get beyond it, it seems as though life would be so much better. They're oftentimes caused by a particular stressor. Something causes these things, and whenever that takes place, these are the areas to which we naturally flee. For some, it's a substance. For others, it might be a relationship. Still others might just tend to lie. But regardless of how we look at it, these are ways that we often cope with hardships or patterns on which we naturally fall. That is the case with Abraham, who once again resorts to deception in order to ensure his own protection. The Word of God contains many examples of individuals who seemingly fall back on the same crutch. It's the reason I've entitled this message, Destructive Crutches. These crutches were lifelong struggles that individuals seemingly face constantly. For example, Jacob frequently resorted to deception. Samson resorted to women. Saul resorted to public approval. Israel resorted to idolatry. We could cite many more examples, but the point is clear. We all have crutches in our life that are often very destructive, and these are the things that we often flee, or these are the things that we often rely upon when we are pressured. These crutches can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some might resort to anger. Others might resort to silence. Some shut down. Others explode. Some go for a drive. Others become more driven. Some lie. Others say whatever comes to mind. Some worry. Others downplay. These are the crutches we often rely on. You think about it in your own life, these are the crutches we often find to be characteristic. Oh, it's no big deal. Meanwhile, inside, we're dying. We tried to downplay it. The infamous argument that takes place in a home, one yells, the other goes silent. That's the crutch. There's a stressor, and we fall back into this area, and we can look at it from a lot of perspective. In some ways, we might look at this as though it's our safe zone, and this is where we naturally go. The problem is we're not going to the right location in any of these things. These are times where we are trying to resolve these things on our own, and the tendencies become very destructive. And so we have to identify them and then establish some guidelines to help us overcome them. Well, we begin in Genesis chapter number 20, and we're going to kind of jump right into the message just simply for sake of time. But I want us to begin with number 1, a deceptive plan. Notice we go again here in Genesis 20. The Bible says, verse 1, Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. Now, we find in Genesis 19, as we studied recently, is just after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities that were located within that valley, Abraham once again travels south. There's nothing in the Word of God that ever indicates his motive. If you were to look at a map geographically, you'll discover Israel comes around and it wraps around to the Sinai Peninsula and would continue over to Egypt. The region that we're talking about, Shur, is just on the east side of the Red Sea, and Kadesh Barnea is typically how Kadesh is regarded, up in the very lower end of the country of Judah. It's down in the southern territory. Last time Abraham was there, we found in Genesis chapter 12 that he continued on to Egypt. Once again, we're right back down in that same area. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but sometimes we just simply need to avoid these areas altogether. But Abraham gets down there. Well, then he goes up to the region of Gerar. Gerar would be what later becomes a Philistine stronghold. And it would be up a little bit further north, in between the Mediterranean Sea and then heading over into the land of Israel. And this is where he sojourns. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Sounds exactly like Genesis chapter 12, except that time it happened to be with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. What we begin to identify, though, first of all, is that partially true statements are intended to deceive. We'll see it here in just a little bit that she actually is his sister, half-sister, half-truth. What's the point in telling a half-truth? To deceive. The whole motive behind it is deception. Every one of us as children can point back to times when we did not tell our parents the entire truth. We might have justified it and said what they don't know won't hurt them. It may be as you grew later in life, when you reached the beyond punishable age, that some of those stories would begin to come out. Hey, do you remember when? And mom and dad would be sitting there going, I had no idea that took place. Well, it's fine because there's nothing you can do about it. I'm a 40-year-old man now. What are you going to do? Ground me? Take my birthday away? It's all right. I, quote unquote, got away with it. Now, let me ask you, did I really? No, not at all. The entire point of a partially true statement is intended to deceive. When you engage in half-truth, the reason behind that is to deceive. We attempt to justify them, but these kinds of statements simply need to be avoided. Secondly, deception is a mode of self-protection, and it completely disregards others. Abraham says, hey, I want you to say she's my sister. We'll see a little bit later on that the reason he did this was he was fearful for his own life. Was Abraham operating in a manner that was for Sarah's well-being? No. Was he operating in a manner that would ultimately glorify the Lord? Absolutely not. He was living in total disregard for his testimony before a pagan king to ensure his own well-being and his own safety. Abimelech was a common designation for a Philistine king. It's quite possible that it is not his name, but is actually a title similar to that of Pharaoh. Now, keep it in mind that Sarah, by this point in time, was 95 years old. I have to tread very, very carefully here. She must have been quite beautiful at 95 years old for this king to still want to take her into his harem. And he did so. We're going to stop there because I can see I'll end up going down the wrong path. And I'll poke my little head up in a kindergarten place and find out that I'm about to get shot. But anyway, you look at this. Here she's taken. Now, the custom would be that she'd be taken and put into his harem, kept in isolation for a few months, just to be sure she was not expecting any child. And once she proved to not be expecting a child, she would just simply become another one of the king's wives. This was custom then. And this is the same plot that Abraham once again falls into. It's a deceptive plan. Number two, there's a terrifying dream. I can't imagine how this went. You can only hear the words. Verse number 3, God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. First of all, I want you to see that God's standards are neither defined nor altered by culture or man's declaration. I want you to notice Abraham says, she's my sister. Now, wives, can you imagine if that was what your husband said about you? Most men in here do not have the courage to make that statement, even jokingly. Okay? That's just some rule that says that is not what you say. This is what Abraham claimed, but what did God say? She is another man's wife. God's standard didn't change. So here comes this solemn pronouncement of certain death. What a way to wake up. You, sir, are a dead man, because the woman that you have taken is a wife of another man. Abimelech, learns a vital lesson regarding both God's knowledge as well as God's standards. Abraham says, she is my sister. God says, no, she is his wife. God's standards are neither defined nor altered by culture or man's declaration. Let me phrase it a little differently. It matters not what man says. What ultimately matters is what God says. And God's assessment is an assessment that is always just and perfect. God is never wrong. God never has missed any details that mankind may seek to cover up. He is omniscient, and he is therefore knowledgeable of every single detail about you as well as about me. What a terrifying thought. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13 declares this solemnly by stating, neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. The writer of Hebrews states it well, that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That's a reality that our culture has forgotten, and it is a reality that many professing believers have likewise forgotten. We have tragically taken and attempted to substitute culture and put Christianity into its place, add just a few things to it, and think that God is going to be pleased by it. I can assure you that God is not going to be pleased by that kind of worship. Number two, we find that God always acts in a manner consistent with his nature. Verse number 4. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou also slay a righteous nation? To this point, Abimelech had not come near her, and he appeals to God on the basis of his just nature to spare his life. Now, I want to be very clear that there's nothing that indicates that Abimelech is a God-fearing individual. Yet at the same point in time, Abimelech, interestingly, possessed certain ideas about the nature of God. God's nature served as the basis of Abraham's request to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you remember Genesis chapter 18 and verse 23 when Abraham was speaking with the Lord? He asked, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Very similar wording that is taking place here. Here is a pagan king who has an idea about God. Incidentally, unsaved people have certain ideas about God. They reason, well, if God were a loving God, he wouldn't do certain things. I recently read something from an individual that I was a little bit shocked by. I had grown up with this particular person, and the focus was, the conclusion essentially that you end up coming away from it is this individual believes that God is neither loving nor good based on what he allows to happen. And he looks at circumstances and says, well, why is such and such a person born into an abusive home? God must not be loving and God must not be good. To my knowledge, I know he claimed to be a Christian, but you start throwing things out like that, and it starts throwing a whole lot of doubt into a lot of things. But unsaved people have ideas about God. Abimelech perceived God to be just. Is God just? Yes. But Abimelech also perceived himself to be innocent. So he's not completely accurate here, okay? Incidentally, incorrect beliefs about God and man's guilt are formed whenever the Bible is not the basis of our beliefs. Okay? Well, it's not my fault. Now, take a look at the Word of God. It probably is your fault. All right? And probably then some. But unsaved people often attempt to appeal to experience as the basis of their beliefs, and so they form incorrect conclusions. He says, said he not unto me, verse 5, that she is my sister? Hey, look, I'm innocent. I'm doing this innocently, and it's very clear that you're not. Number 3, God graciously acted on Abimelech's behalf and gave him an additional opportunity. Verse 5. Said he not unto me, she is my sister? And the answer is yes. And she, even she herself, said, he is my brother. Abraham and Sarah are both involved in this plan. They are both engaged in deception. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. That word integrity is a great word to be able to study, but I do want to point out to you that his definition of integrity and God's definition of integrity are two totally different things. There's nothing about his actions that would be righteous in God's eyes. In his eyes, it would be perfectly acceptable. He's just taking another wife. This is what culture does. That's never been God's plan. You can find that all the way back from the beginning of time. Yet he looks at this and says, well, I'm doing this innocently. Mankind naturally tries to proclaim his own innocence. We want to justify ourselves. We want to make ourselves appear better. We want to make our sin appear less significant. He sincerely believed that he acted with innocence, but he was not innocent. Just because a person says he's innocent or believes himself to be innocent does not mean that he is innocent. We're looking at this in our study in 1 John. He that saith is a phrase that you find repeatedly. Here is a person who is continuously making an assertion. That assertion may or may not be true, and it will be evidenced by his lifestyle. You find that all throughout the book of 1 John. He that saith this, it is easy to say you're innocent, but that does not mean you are innocent. Well, God continues to speak to him in a dream. Verse 6, God said unto him in a dream, this is not a second dream, it's all going on at the same time. Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. Does that mean God is approving of what Abimelech has done? Absolutely not. He realizes, however, that in his mind he was innocent in doing this. This, again, does not declare that God is condoning his actions. But I also want you to notice God's grace, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. In God's grace, God acted on behalf of Abimelech in ways he did not even realize. God prevented Abimelech from further sinning against God and did not allow him to touch her. God often acts in ways that we do not see, ways that we do not comprehend. In fact, I would say that some of God's most gracious acts are those very things that he has prevented us from obtaining. Sometimes we get in our minds that we think we know what we want. The psalmist speaks of God granting their request but sending leanness to their soul. Sometimes we get pretty determined on what we want. And we get pretty mad when God does not give us what we think we want. Let me challenge you to look at that from a much different perspective and realize that that's one of God's greatest displays of his grace, is not giving us what we think we want. Some of the greatest answers to prayer that I've had, as difficult as they were the times God said no. And it redirected, or it kept a focus where the focus needed to be. Are they difficult to accept? Absolutely they are. But that's the right way of going about and accepting it. I suffered thee not to touch her. I did not permit this. Did Abimelech act conscious of this reality? Absolutely not. He had no idea what's going on. To him, it might be nothing more than a mere coincidence how many things are described today. But God is behind the scenes, and God is still at work. Now, therefore, he says in verse 7, restore the man his wife. For Abimelech to continue to pursue Sarah at this point would be to defy God's clear command. If he were to continue, it would bring about certain death. Restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet. First time we find that word in the Bible. Very interesting time for that to be said of Abraham. I could have seen that statement back in Genesis chapter 18 when he was fervently interceding on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. But to think of Abraham as God's spokesperson in Gerar in the midst of this lie is something else to see. Obviously, his actions damaged his testimony. I wonder if you could have seen Abimelech's facial reactions when he heard that. I wonder what they would have been. He's a prophet. What? He's a prophet? You ever had people say he's a preacher? And you're like, what? That guy? He's a preacher? What a tragic testimony. What about the person who says he's a Christian? And the coworker says, what? I've worked beside him for years and would never think he's a Christian. What a tragic shame. But what a reality for far too many believers. He's a prophet. He's God's spokesman. But I also see in that God's grace is seen and that God was willing to still use Abraham and still use him as his mouthpiece. Restore him his wife. He's a prophet, and he will pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. You return Sarah, and if you do so, you will live. If you do not do so, you will die, and everyone in your household. Did God force Abimelech to obey? No. He gave him a choice. Now, not a very good option. I say not a very, one's a very good option, but it's fairly clear which one you want. Well, let me think about this for a moment, says Abimelech. Okay, you never find that at all. But the Word of God, and I go through and I can't help but think of where Israel was said, you know what, I've set before you the paths of life and death. Amen. Choose life. Why would you choose anything differently? Let me look at our Christian life. Here's a path of blessing. Here's a path of chastisement. Why would you choose anything differently? There is no good answer to that question. But Christians do it time after time after time after time. Restore her, he'll pray for you and you'll live. Keep her and you'll die. Verse 8, then Abimelech rose early in the morning. I personally think that was very easy for him to do. I think after this particular dream, he did not get a whole lot of sleep. Okay? Didn't need an alarm clock to get out of bed this morning. But we move on and we see here a powerful rebuke. Verse 8, he rose up early in the morning and he called all his servants and told all these things in their ears. And the men were sore afraid. So here are all of his servants. And again, there's nothing that indicates these are godly individuals. He tells them everything that has transpired during the night. And the result of this is these individuals are filled with terror. They are filled with a fear of God's judgment. We might even reason that these individuals appear to have had a greater fear of God's judgment than Abraham himself did. Of all of the people in this passage, Abraham seems most unmoved by it. I do believe he's moved, but Abimelech is terrified by it. If Abraham had entered into this scene with that same kind of terror, how would the story have been written differently? So Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us, and what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. What we find is that our actions have ramifications we seldom comprehend. Abimelech says to him, Hey, what have you done to us? It is clear that Abimelech regarded Abraham and his deception as the basis of the problem. Abimelech had enough discernment to realize that the actions of Abraham nearly resulted in the judgment of the entire kingdom. We often have very little understanding regarding the ramifications of our actions. We view ourselves as isolated. We view our lives as it's okay to do whatever we want because it's just me and I'm not hurting anybody. The reality is your actions have tremendous ramifications. And we find, secondly, in this powerful rebuke that ungodly people can have certain morals for living. You know what he says? You, Abraham, the end of verse 9, you've done things to me that ought not to be done. Just because a person is unsaved does not mean he does not possess morals. There are lots of unsaved people who are honest. There are lots of unsaved people who are faithful. There are lots of unsaved people who simply do what they are supposed to do. There are unsaved businessmen that are extremely honest. How tragic that there are far too many Christians who are dishonest. And here comes a rebuke from an ungodly person and says, You've done things that ought not to be done. What a challenge. Here's this man of faith. You've acted in a way that you shouldn't have acted. The unsaved will hold you as a believer to a higher standard. That's a fact. Well, it's just not right. Well, get over it. It's a fact. It's a reality that they are going to look at you and say, Wow, you shouldn't talk like that. You claim to go to church. You shouldn't act like that. You claim to go to church. And that's typically how they'll associate Christianity. You go to church. That's part of the problem with our culture today. All right, go to church. Well, we need a whole lot more Christians who go to church. But anyway, you do these things, and you shouldn't talk like that. It's okay for me to talk like that, but you shouldn't talk like that. Growing up as a pastor's son, there were higher expectations. You could fight it all you wanted, but it was reality. Didn't matter. Those expectations were there. My girls have experienced to a degree similarly, although our church here has been very gracious, and this has been the only church they've known. But there have been times where, as the daughter of the principal, they're never to misbehave in school. Well, incidentally, they did. Okay, some more than others, but there were standards there. Well, and they're held to a higher standard. And we can fuss and fume all we want about it, but we're better to accept the reality that this is what it's going to be. We move from a powerful rebuke to number 4, a pathetic excuse. I'm not impressed with Abraham's reasoning. I have to say that. Verse number 9, Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? What have I offended thee? Why did you do this? Okay, verse 10. Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? In other words, what caused you? What was the motive behind this? What did you perceive? A person's perception is how he chooses to view something. It's a choice. But it's how you choose to view things. I've also said a person's perception is his reality. It's the reality in which they'll often function. But let me also state that misperceptions result in a faulty view of reality. And you cannot condone it. Okay? If I put glasses on that have red lenses and sit here and tell you adamantly that everything in here is red, that is my perception. For me, that is my reality. You would sit there and say that is a misperception. You probably are not going to say, oh, that's fine, preacher. Yep, everything's red. Some of you in here might say, oh, bless his heart. Okay? The southern phrase that no person wants to hear. If it's a northerner coming down and you say, oh, bless your heart, it's fine because they ain't got a clue what you're saying to them. But it is not a compliment. A person's misperception is a faulty view of reality. And you can't condone that. You can't blindly turn an eye and say, well, it's okay. What did you see, Abraham, that resulted in your actions? Let me say that Abraham acted on several misperceptions. He acted on the misperception of their nature. He said in verse number 11, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place. These are not God-fearing individuals. These are individuals who are not governed by the fear of God. Isn't it interesting that the individual who is making this claim is not living in a manner that is governed by the fear of God? Those with misperceptions often see flaws in others that they choose to ignore in themselves. This is a constant battle. Oh, that person over there, and whatever, 9 times out of 10, I'll almost say it like this, that what grates you the most is probably characteristic of your own life. That's just the reality of it. And the person with the misperception, he's perfect, and it's everyone else, and they cannot for the life of them see they have the exact problem to the nth degree in their own lives. Here is a God-fearing man not acting in a God-fearing way, saying those people are not God-fearing individuals. If that doesn't make you want to do the facepalm, I don't know what does. They're not God-fearing individuals. Well, thank you, Mr. God-fearing individual, Abimelech could easily have said. He had a misperception of the nature of these people, but secondly, he incorrectly perceived the result. They will slay me for my wife's sake. What's the problem with that? God promised that he would have a seed. He can't be killed. God would not be God. He would, if they took his life, God's promises would fail. So he reasons, well, they're going to kill me. And he failed to reason by faith that God is going to give him a son. A promise that incidentally, in Genesis 18, was very recently reiterated. In fact, you're going to have a son by Sarah within a year. That's been recently stated. We're still within that time frame. But yet he's already forgotten. Not only did he have these misperceptions, but Abraham attempted to justify his actions. And yet, indeed, she is my sister. She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. She became my wife. I see in this, again, an attempt to justify the actions. And I think he failed at justifying both before God as well as Abimelech. I do find verse 13 to be interesting. It came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house. I read that and I can't help but hear a little bit of blame perhaps being shifted on God. You remember Adam, it's the woman that thou gavest me? When God caused me to have to leave this, Sarah and I concocted this plan 25 years ago. That I said unto her, this is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. This is a pretty lousy way of demonstrating kindness. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, he is my brother. This is over 25 years ago that this plan was concocted. But it is the crutch upon which Abraham and Sarah constantly fell. This is what they depended on. Why? For our own safety. Here's a shocking statement. You cannot lean on God and on self-made crutches at the same time. It's one or the other. You can't lean on God and on self-made crutches at the same time. That crutch is nothing more than a fleshly dependence. We find number 5, a restored relationship. Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham and restored him Sarah his wife. Why did he give him this stuff? Almost like a tithe in the sense that he, not necessarily 10%, but in the sense that he recognized him to be the greater person. I will say this, it's probably on the basis of his respect for his position, not out of respect for him as an individual at this point in time. But he gives him these things. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before thee. Dwell where it pleaseth thee. What a gracious man. I would have said, stay away from here. Okay? There's a rock on the other side of that sandcastle right there. Stay, that's my property. Get away. Do not cross that rock. Go where you want. And unto Sarah he said, this one I smile at every time I read it. Hey, Sarah, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Ouch. Okay? A little sense of humor, a little sarcasm, and you can't help but see it. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes, and unto all that are with thee, and with all other, thus she was reproved. In other words, this 1,000 pieces of silver was a compensation that would vindicate her in the eyes of everyone else. So Abraham, verse 17, prayed unto God. Don't you wish you could know the content of that prayer? How did that prayer start? Hey, Lord, it's me again. Boy, have I done it again. I don't know how the prayer started. I would be puzzled to learn the content of the prayer. But God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his maidservants, and they bare children. And here's a part to the story that is not added, or is added now, that was not revealed earlier. The Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. God did not allow anyone within that household to bear children. We focused on destructive crutches. I want to conclude just quickly with overcoming repetitive sin. It's obvious this is something that Abraham and Sarah dealt with. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'll find that we too have many things that we just have a tendency to rely on. Number 1, identify the weakness. You can't be victorious in something you choose not to identify. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself before God. He already knows a particular weakness that you have. And those weaknesses may vary, but you have to identify that weakness. What is it that I go to? If I get extremely mad, I'll blow up. If I get somewhat mad, I'll go silent. I know that about me. So when I blow up, it's not a good thing at all, okay? But those are weaknesses. Some individuals struggle with an addiction to something, to whatever it is. Identify that weakness. Don't stick your head in the sand and pretend that it doesn't exist. Number 2, establish parameters to avoid the weakness. We call them standards. They're guardrails. The Bible says in Romans chapter 14, to make not provision for the lust of the flesh, to fulfill the lust of the flesh. In other words, you know this is a weakness, stay away from it. So you struggle with alcohol. Don't get an apartment over top of a bar. Right? You struggle with your thought life. Guard what you see. Guard what you watch on television. It might be fine for someone else, but it may not be fine for you. These are standards. These are guardrails that help us make sound decisions. Number 3, eliminate the crutches of self-dependence. Far too many times I hear Christians say, "Oh, I can do it. I can handle it." Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. I can do all things through myself which strengtheneth me. No. I can do all things through Christ. These crutches that you want to fall back on, the job, the income, all of these things. Oh, it's getting tough. I need to take on a second job. Maybe it's getting tough. I need to pray more. You see? These are the crutches that we oftentimes want to fall back on, and we make some tragic decisions when we fall back on these. And number 4, rely wholly on God for strength. Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not to thine own understanding. You rely wholly on God. And what you'll discover is these may still be lifelong battles that you face, but you'll also discover there's hope to be able to overcome them. You don't have to succumb to it, and you might choose to. 25 years of growth for Abraham, and that old sin reared its ugly head one more time. You're never too old to think that you're above sin. That lifestyle that you had years ago can come right back up in a flash. That's why the Bible says to keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.